By the time the harsh winter months of early 1945 arrived, the great conflict raging across the Pacific Ocean had reached a turning point that would determine its ultimate outcome. The Philippine archipelago, which had fallen under American administration decades earlier, held tremendous importance for multiple reasons. Beyond its symbolic value as territory that needed to be reclaimed, the islands possessed critical infrastructure, including numerous harbours and landing strips that would prove essential for any future operations aimed at the Japanese home islands themselves. Douglas MacArthur, the commanding general who had been compelled to abandon these islands back in 1942 after making his famous pledge to one day come back, now felt an overwhelming urgency to retake the capital city as swiftly as military operations would permit. His motivations were complex and multi-layered. Thousands of Allied prisoners remained trapped in Japanese custody within the city limits, their lives hanging in the balance with each passing day. Additionally, the symbolic importance of restoring the exiled Philippine government to its rightful seat of power weighed heavily on strategic considerations. The general understood that speed and decisive action could make the difference between liberation and massacre. However, not everyone in the American military hierarchy shared MacArthur's assessment of the situation or his preferred approach to solving it. Walter Kruger, who commanded the Sixth Army and bore direct responsibility for ground operations, advocated for a more methodical and cautious strategy. His concerns centered on the substantial Japanese forces that remained scattered throughout the mountainous terrain of Luzon. Kruger worried that rushing headlong toward Manila without first securing the rear areas and consolidating positions around Lingayen Gulf could leave American supply lines vulnerable to devastating counterattacks from enemy units operating in the highlands. His military training and experience suggested that patience and thorough preparation would ultimately save lives and ensure success. MacArthur, however, rejected this conservative approach with characteristic boldness. He argued forcefully that every day of delay gave the Japanese additional time to fortify their positions within Manila, systematically destroy the city's infrastructure, and potentially execute the thousands of prisoners and internees held in various camps and facilities. The general harbored hopes that Japanese commanders might declare Manila an open city, thereby sparing it from destruction, just as American forces had done when they abandoned it 3 years earlier. With this reasoning, he issued direct orders for an immediate advance, overruling the more cautious voices within his command structure. The Japanese side of this equation proved equally fractured by disagreement and conflicting strategic visions. Tomoyuki Yamashita, the general responsible for defending the Philippines, possessed a clear-eyed understanding of the military realities facing his forces. He recognized that attempting to hold Manila against the overwhelming American advantages in firepower, supplies, and reinforcements would amount to nothing more than a suicidal gesture that would accomplish little beyond the senseless death of his soldiers. Yamashita's plan called for withdrawing the bulk of his forces into the rugged northern mountains of Luzon, where they could conduct an extended guerrilla campaign that would tie down American troops and resources for months or even years. To implement this strategy, Yamashita issued explicit orders to Shizuo Yokoyama, who commanded the Shimbu group responsible for the Manila area. These directives required Yokoyama to evacuate all forces from the capital and to assume command over all naval personnel operating in the region, bringing them under unified army control. This would theoretically ensure an orderly withdrawal and prevent the kind of last-ditch defense that Yamashita knew would prove catastrophic. But the Imperial Japanese military's complex and often dysfunctional command structure created a fatal complication. Denshiji Okochi, a vice-admiral with authority over naval forces, issued contradictory instructions that directly countermanded Yamashita's withdrawal orders. Okochi commanded Sanji Iwabuchi, a rear admiral responsible for Manila's naval defense forces, to hold the city regardless of cost. The vice-admiral's reasoning combined practical concerns about protecting valuable naval installations with emotional motivations rooted in a desire to avenge previous humiliations, particularly the loss of the battleship Kirishima during the Guadalcanal campaign. Iwabuchi, displaying the fierce loyalty to naval hierarchy that often characterized Japanese military culture, chose to obey his direct naval superiors rather than the army general who theoretically held overall authority in the region. He began gathering every available man under his command, assembling a ragtag force of approximately 17,000 personnel. This heterogeneous collection included sailors whose ships had been sunk, marine infantry units, mechanics and support personnel, auxiliary troops from Korea and Taiwan, and even civilian workers who were pressed into military service. Despite their lack of proper training and equipment for land combat, Iwabuchi instilled in them an absolute determination to fight until death rather than surrender. The reality of their equipment situation presented severe challenges. This improvised garrison lacked the tanks, heavy artillery pieces, and standard infantry weapons that would normally equip a force of such size. Necessity forced them to become resourceful and creative. They stripped approximately 990 20mm automatic weapons from damaged or grounded aircraft, repurposing these anti-aircraft guns for ground combat. An additional 600 machine guns of various types were gathered from naval stores. A handful of 120mm guns provided some heavier firepower, though nothing approaching what a properly equipped defensive force would possess. Naval bombs and torpedoes were converted into improvised mines. Most desperately, many soldiers found themselves armed with nothing more than crude spears fashioned by lashing bayonets to wooden poles, preparing to face modern American weapons with implements that would not have seemed out of place in medieval warfare. Against this backdrop of strategic confusion and improvised defense, MacArthur personally inserted himself into the tactical situation with characteristic dramatic flair. On the 31st of January in 1945, he appeared at the command post of the 1st Cavalry Division near Lingjeon, where he delivered direct orders for an immediate advance toward the capital. His presence and personal authority left no room for hesitation or delay. Just 60 seconds after midnight marked the beginning of February 1st. Specially organised motorised units known as the Flying Columns departed from their assembly areas. These fully mechanised cavalry detachments represented a new form of mobile warfare, combining speed and firepower in a way that previous generations of horse-mounted cavalry could never have achieved. They embarked on an extraordinary forced march that would carry them more than 100 miles through dense jungle terrain and mountainous roads. The grueling journey took 66 consecutive hours of movement, with brief pauses only for refueling and minimal rest. This remarkable feat of endurance and logistics brought them to Manila's outskirts in record time, catching the Japanese defenders off guard with the speed of the American advance. The 37th Infantry Division began its own march toward the capital on the 4th of February, following routes parallel to the cavalry's advance. Within days, the mechanized units of the 1st Cavalry found themselves pushing into the city's outer residential districts and suburbs. MacArthur established 3 urgent priorities for these initial forces. First, they needed to liberate the internees imprisoned at Santo Tomas University, where several thousand Allied civilians had been held since the Japanese occupation began. Second, they were to seize Malacanang Palace, the seat of government power and a potent symbol of Philippine sovereignty. Third, they needed to capture the Legislative Building, another vital symbol of civil authority. The night of February 3rd brought the first significant success when elements of the 8th Cavalry Regiment reached the gates of Santo Tomas University. The guards on duty, predominantly Taiwanese auxiliaries rather than Japanese regular troops, offered virtually no meaningful resistance when confronted by American tanks and infantry. Approximately 3,500 prisoners, the majority being American civilians, along with British and Dutch nationals who had endured captivity since 1942, experienced overwhelming emotional releases as their liberators broke through the gates. Tears flowed freely as internees embraced soldiers, some collapsing from the sudden relief after years of deprivation and uncertainty. However, the situation remained dangerous and complex. 63 Japanese soldiers had barricaded themselves inside the main academic building, holding 275 hostages in a tense standoff. Negotiations stretched across 2 agonizing days, with American officers working to resolve the crisis without triggering a massacre. Not until the 5th of February did the Japanese finally release their captives and surrender, allowing the rescue operation to be completed. The immediate aftermath of liberation created new challenges for American forces. Thousands of newly freed internees required food, medical attention, and basic supplies that the cavalry units had not brought in sufficient quantities. Their logistical situation worsened dramatically when Japanese demolition teams destroyed the Novolisches Bridge, a critical span that served as a main supply route into the city. The destruction left the 1st Cavalry Division critically short of ammunition, food, and fuel, forcing commanders to improvise resupply methods while simultaneously continuing combat operations. As American forces pressed deeper into Manila proper, they encountered increasingly sophisticated Japanese defensive preparations. The enemy had transformed the city itself into a vast fortification system. Building after building had been converted into miniature fortresses, with walls reinforced, windows converted to firing ports, and interlocking fields of fire carefully planned. Streets and intersections bristled with obstacles designed to channel American forces into kill zones. The Noguchi Detachment, one of the Japanese units operating in the city, implemented a scorched earth policy that added to the chaos and destruction. They systematically set fire to buildings along the Pasig River, particularly targeting structures that could provide cover or observation points for American forces. Fuel storage facilities erupted in massive conflagrations that sent columns of black smoke towering over the city. Military installations received special attention, with demolition teams planting explosives throughout facilities before retreating. Filipino civilians, initially jubilant at the arrival of American forces, poured into the streets in massive numbers. They showered liberators with gifts, flowers, and expressions of gratitude that sometimes overwhelmed the soldiers they meant to honor. However, this civilian presence created serious operational challenges. Some took advantage of the chaos to loot abandoned stores and Japanese facilities, creating congestion and disorder that hampered military movements. Commanders struggled to balance the joy of liberation with the practical necessity of maintaining order and continuing combat operations. By the 7th of February, American forces had secured nearly all territory north of the Pasig River, which divided Manila into northern and southern sections. The surviving Japanese defenders executed a fighting withdrawal to the southern bank, systematically demolishing all 6 major bridges spanning the waterway as they retreated. This destruction transformed the river into a significant military obstacle that would require engineering solutions before the advance could continue. Oscar Griswold, the Lieutenant General commanding 14th Corps, issued new operational orders to maintain momentum despite the destroyed bridges. He directed the 37th Division to expand its control eastward along the northern bank, while the 1st Cavalry Division executed a sweeping movement around the eastern and southern approaches to the city, creating an encirclement that would trap Japanese forces against the bay. The 37th Division began its assault crossing on that same 7th day of February. The 148th and 129th Regiments launched the operation using engineer boats and amphibious vehicles to traverse the river. The initial wave of assault craft made it across without encountering significant resistance, leading some soldiers to hope the crossing might proceed unopposed. However, Japanese observers had simply been waiting for more lucrative targets. When the second wave pushed off from the northern bank, Japanese machine gunners and riflemen opened fire from carefully concealed positions on the southern shore. Heavy-caliber bullets shredded the wooden oars of many boats, forcing soldiers to improvise desperately. Some paddled with their rifle butts, others used helmets or even bare hands to propel their craft toward the southern bank. The crossing turned into a chaotic struggle as men fought both the current and enemy fire. The assault troops aimed for Malacanang Gardens, the only section of the southern riverbank lacking the high embankments that characterized most of the shoreline. This open terrain made the landing site tactically feasible, but also exposed the soldiers to intense fire during their approach. Despite heavy casualties, enough men reached the shore to establish a precarious bridgehead that follow-on forces could expand. Engineers worked throughout the following day to construct a pontoon bridge capable of handling vehicle traffic. The two-lane floating bridge they erected represented an impressive feat of military engineering under combat conditions, but its completion created an unexpected problem. Hundreds of Filipino civilians, desperate to escape the fighting that was intensifying south of the river, surged onto the bridge in a massive exodus. The press of humanity became so severe that military traffic ground to a halt, forcing American military police to implement crowd control measures that seemed harsh but proved necessary to maintain the flow of troops and supplies toward the fighting. Once across the river, the 37th Division confronted an urban battlefield unlike anything most American soldiers had previously experienced. The southern districts consisted of densely packed industrial facilities interspersed with residential blocks, all of which the Japanese had converted into mutually supporting defensive positions. Buildings constructed of reinforced concrete became miniature fortresses that could withstand considerable punishment from small arms fire and even light artillery. Provisor Island, a small landmass in the Pasig River, housed the city's steam-powered electrical generation plant. This massive structure of steel girders and stone walls had been transformed into a fortress that dominated the surrounding area. Japanese defenders had constructed sandbag bunkers at key points and positioned machine guns to cover all approaches. American infantry had to cross open water under fire, then fight their way through dark, smoke-filled corridors while the massive generators continued to rumble and hiss. The close-quarters combat that raged through the facility resembled something from an earlier era of warfare, with soldiers fighting hand-to-hand in narrow passages choked with steam and cordite smoke. 2 full days of brutal combat, which cost 25 American lives, passed before the power plant finally fell silent under American control. The 148th Regiment continued pushing south through the Pandacon district, where they encountered relatively light resistance that allowed rapid progress. However, this advance came to an abrupt halt at Paco railway station, where Japanese defenders had created an especially formidable position. The railway infrastructure itself provided excellent defensive terrain. Raised tracks and platforms created natural obstacles, while the station buildings and surrounding structures had been reinforced and fortified. 20mm automatic cannons covered every approach from protected positions. Concrete bunkers dotted the complex, connected by trenches that allowed defenders to shift positions without exposing themselves. Even the adjacent church had been incorporated into the defensive system, with its bell tower serving as an observation and firing position that gave Japanese spotters a commanding view of the surrounding area. American infantry attempting to assault this position found themselves pinned down by withering fire. Progress could only be measured in yards, with soldiers crawling forward during brief lulls in the defensive fire. Bazooka teams worked to blast holes in walls and bunkers, creating entry points for assault teams. Each successful penetration of the defences required careful coordination, with covering fire allowing small groups to rush forward during moments of opportunity. After 10 separate assault attempts, each one leaving more casualties on both sides, American forces finally overran the last defensive positions at 8:45 in the morning on the 10th of February. The cost had been severe. 45 Americans died in the fighting, while 307 more suffered wounds of varying severity. This butcher's bill for capturing a single railway station illustrated the brutal arithmetic of urban combat. From that point forward, the battle devolved into a methodical but costly process of reducing fortified positions one by one. Individual city blocks became miniature battlefields, with buildings converted into strongpoints that provided covering fire for neighbouring positions. This created defensive networks where destroying one position simply exposed attackers to fire from adjacent buildings, requiring the systematic reduction of entire neighbourhoods rather than isolated structures. Initially, MacArthur had imposed strict limitations on the use of artillery within the city limits. His orders permitted fire only against targets that American observers could positively identify and designate, with the goal of preserving Manila's historic buildings and civilian infrastructure. However, as American casualties mounted and the slow pace of advance became apparent, these restrictions came under increasing criticism from field commanders who argued that they were sacrificing soldiers to preserve buildings. On the 10th of February, the same day Paco Station fell, MacArthur rescinded these limitations. From that point forward, artillery support became an integral part of every assault. The change in tactics proved immediately effective in reducing casualties, though at tremendous cost to the city itself. Before each infantry assault, batteries of 105mm and 155mm guns would pound target buildings into rubble. Tanks rolled forward to provide direct fire support, their main guns blasting walls at point-blank range. Flamethrower teams followed, burning out any defenders who might have survived the bombardment in cellars or reinforced rooms. Only after this systematic destruction would infantry assault teams move forward to clear the ruins. Even then, defenders sometimes survived to contest the rubble, forcing repeated attacks against the same objective until resistance finally ceased. The new police station complex on Marqués de Camilla Street exemplified the challenges of this brutal urban warfare. Japanese defenders had occupied not just the police headquarters building, but also an adjacent shoe factory, a social club, and a school, creating an interconnected fortress that covered an entire city block. Each building had been prepared for defense with overlapping fields of fire, reinforced walls, and fallback positions that allowed defenders to conduct a fighting retreat through the complex. The resulting battle consumed 8 full days of continuous combat. Fresh American regiments had to be committed as initial assault units exhausted themselves. Tanks charged directly at buildings in desperate attempts to break through. Flamethrowers, white phosphorus grenades, and high-explosive artillery shells reduced much of the complex to burning rubble before the last defenders were finally eliminated. While the 37th Division ground forward through the southern districts in this brutal building-to-building combat, the 1st Cavalry Division executed its assigned encirclement movement with greater speed and less opposition. On the 8th of February, the 8th and 5th Cavalry Regiments crossed the Pasig River east and south of the main urban area, bypassing the strongest Japanese positions. The 8th Regiment took a more direct route toward the bay, while the 5th swung in a wider arc through the Makati area. Both units encountered scattered resistance from small Japanese detachments, but avoided the kind of sustained combat that was grinding down the 37th Division in the city centre. The 5th Cavalry's most significant action came at the Makati electrical generation facility, which they captured on the 10th of February. In accordance with Kruger's policy of preserving vital infrastructure wherever possible, the cavalry conducted a careful assault that secured the facility largely intact, allowing it to be returned to service once the battle ended. By the 12th of February, both cavalry regiments had reached the shores of Manila Bay, completing the encirclement and sealing off any possibility of Japanese escape or reinforcement. They then wheeled northward along the waterfront, closing the ring while advancing toward a link-up with the 37th Division forces pushing south from the river. This coastal advance brought the cavalry into contact with several fortified positions that the Japanese had established in Manila's recreational and educational facilities. Harrison Park, Rizal Stadium, and LaSalle University had all been converted into defensive strongpoints. At Rizal Stadium, Japanese defenders had dug elaborate bunker systems into the baseball field itself, creating a network of interconnected fighting positions beneath the ground. American forces had to systematically clear this underground warren using flamethrowers to burn out defenders and explosives to collapse tunnels. Tanks proved particularly valuable in this fighting, providing both direct fire support and a degree of protection for infantry as they advanced across open ground. On the 16th of February, operational requirements prompted a significant reorganization of American forces. The 1st Cavalry Brigade, consisting of the 5th and 12th Cavalry Regiments, received orders detaching it from the division and reassigning it to reinforce the 37th Division in the brutal downtown fighting. These fresh units threw themselves into assaults on the Manila Hotel and the High Commissioner's residence, the latter being particularly significant as MacArthur's personal home before the war. The fighting for these structures devolved into room-by-room clearances, with assault teams fighting through corridors and stairwells. MacArthur himself appeared in the rubble-strewn area around his former residence, his presence serving to encourage the soldiers conducting the assault even as it created additional security concerns for his staff. In the northern sectors, where the 37th Division had already cleared most organised resistance, exhausted units finally received relief. On the 19th of February, the 148th Regiment, which had been in continuous combat since crossing the Pasig River nearly 2 weeks earlier, handed over its positions to the 5th Cavalry Regiment and withdrew for rest and reorganisation. The 5th Cavalry immediately pushed forward into new objectives, including the University of the Philippines Hospital Complex. The Japanese had transformed this medical facility into yet another fortress, violating international conventions regarding the protection of hospitals during warfare. Bunkers had been constructed throughout the complex, with firing positions cut into basements and upper floors. Defenders created interlocking fields of fire that covered all approaches to the buildings. The presence of thousands of Filipino patients and civilians trapped inside the hospital created an additional complication, as American forces needed to minimize collateral casualties while still eliminating armed resistance. Days of intense combat gradually wore down the Japanese defenders. Room by room, floor by floor, American soldiers cleared the hospital buildings. By the 23rd of February, only 75 defenders remained from the original garrison of 250 men. Rather than face capture, these survivors committed ritual suicide during the night, ending organized resistance at the hospital. American and Filipino personnel then worked to evacuate more than 7,000 patients and civilians who had been trapped in the facility throughout the fighting, many of them injured or suffering from disease and malnutrition. With the outer defensive ring eliminated and American forces controlling all approaches, the remaining Japanese defenders contracted into Intramuros, the ancient walled city that had served as Manila's heart since Spanish colonial times. This historic district's defensive walls, constructed in the 16th century, rose 40 feet high and stretched several feet thick, built from massive stone blocks that had withstood centuries of tropical weather. The Spanish engineers who designed these fortifications could never have imagined they would one day face modern artillery, but their craftsmanship ensured the walls remained formidable obstacles even against 20th century weapons. American artillery batteries began a systematic bombardment of Intramuros on the 17th of February, employing every available gun to pound the ancient fortress. The barrage continued without interruption for days, with shells of multiple calibers converging on the walled city. By the morning of the 23rd, artillery pieces ranging from 75mm guns through 105mm and 155mm howitzers up to massive 8-inch siege guns had fired more than 7,400 rounds at the walls and buildings of Intramuros. This unprecedented concentration of firepower finally achieved its purpose, blasting a practicable gap in the eastern wall large enough to permit an infantry assault. 10 minutes after the guns fell silent, smoke generator units created an obscuring screen that drifted across the battlefield, providing some concealment for the assault troops. The 129th Regiment crossed the Pasig River in engineer boats, approaching Intramuros from the north, while the 145th Regiment prepared to exploit the breach in the eastern wall. With many Japanese defensive positions already destroyed by the prolonged bombardment, the initial penetration proceeded more rapidly than expected, though progress soon encountered an unexpected obstacle. Waves of Filipino refugees suddenly appeared in the streets, desperately seeking escape from the combat zone. More than 2,000 women and children, whom Japanese soldiers had forcibly herded into Delmonico Church, had not yet been evacuated when the assault began. American supply personnel rushed trucks forward to transport these civilians to safety behind American lines, conducting this humanitarian operation even while combat continued around them. Male civilians, however, faced a grimmer fate. Japanese soldiers separated men from their families and marched them into Fort Santiago, where they were subsequently executed en masse in one of many atrocities committed during the battle. Inside the confines of Intramuros, the 129th and 145th Regiments advanced through narrow colonial-era streets that had become deadly corridors. Each lane and alley concealed dugouts, fighting positions, and booby traps. Spanish-era buildings provided excellent defensive positions, with thick walls and limited access points that favoured the defenders. Fort Santiago, located in the northwestern corner of Intramuros, presented particular challenges. This historic fortress had served as a prison during Spanish colonial rule, most famously holding national hero José Rizal before his execution. Now its dark labyrinth of cells, passages, and underground chambers sheltered the last defenders of this sector. American assault teams found traditional infantry tactics ineffective against enemies concealed in stone vaults beneath ground level. They resorted to desperate expedients, pouring gasoline and fuel oil through ventilation shafts, then igniting this volatile mixture with white phosphorus grenades. Flamethrower teams swept through accessible passages, the distinctive roar of their weapons echoing off ancient stonework as they systematically cleared each chamber. Flames licked upward along moss-covered walls while acrid smoke filled the underground spaces, forcing defenders into the open where they could be engaged. After clearing the cell blocks and subterranean passages, American forces reported Fort Santiago secured by midday on the 25th of February. Some Japanese defenders attempted desperate deceptions to survive or strike final blows against their enemies. Several disguised themselves in captured American uniforms, carrying M1 rifles taken from the dead, hoping to infiltrate American positions or escape the encirclement. Others raised white flags from Delmonico Church's bell tower, feigning surrender, only to open fire when American soldiers approached. These ruses accomplished nothing beyond ensuring that legitimate surrender attempts would be viewed with suspicion. None of the soldiers who attempted these deceptions survived. Of the entire Japanese garrison in Intramuros, only 25 Taiwanese auxiliary troops chose to surrender rather than die fighting. As dawn broke on the 26th of February, with the fortress lost and American forces overrunning the last defensive positions, Rear Admiral Iwabuchi and his surviving staff officers gathered inside the agriculture building to perform ritual suicide. Their deaths marked the effective end of organized Japanese resistance in Manila, though several massive structures still required clearing. 3 reinforced concrete government buildings remained as the final objectives of the battle. The Legislative Building, Finance Building, and Agriculture Building, all constructed to modern standards with steel reinforcement and thick concrete walls, had been transformed into fortresses that could withstand punishment that would have leveled ordinary structures. Each building now required individual assault operations that resembled sieges in miniature. The 148th Regiment launched their assault on the Legislative Building, only to discover that Japanese defenders had prepared the interior with diabolical ingenuity. They had drilled holes through floors and ceilings, creating vertical firing positions that allowed them to rain grenades and small arms fire down on American soldiers attempting to advance through the building. Each floor became a separate battlefield, with assault teams forced to clear rooms methodically while under fire from above and below. After initial assaults failed with heavy casualties, American commanders withdrew their forces and called for more artillery support. Not until the 28th of February did the structure finally fall to American control, after additional bombardment had demolished much of the interior structure. Meanwhile, the 5th Cavalry Regiment tackled the Agriculture Building, encountering immediate complications from fire coming from the nearby San Luis Terrace apartments. Japanese defenders had established positions in this residential complex that covered the approaches to the Agriculture Building, making a direct assault suicidal. The cavalry had to detour to clear the apartments first, conducting a separate battle that consumed additional time and resources before they could return to their primary objective. On the 28th of February, American artillery pieces were wheeled into position for direct fire against the agriculture building's foundation. 155mm guns fired at point-blank range, their shells punching through concrete and steel at ranges where they could hardly miss. Tanks ground forward to press their main guns against the building's base, systematically destroying the lower levels to undermine the entire structure. Flamethrower teams burned out defensive positions while bazooka crews and grenadiers attacked gun nests. White phosphorus grenades created choking smoke and searing heat that drove defenders from their positions. On the 1st of March, American officers attempted to arrange a surrender, calling out in Japanese for the defenders to lay down their arms. Only silence answered them. They responded with renewed bombardment, pouring fuel oil and high explosives into the structure in quantities sufficient to collapse entire sections. The building's structural integrity gradually failed under this sustained punishment, with walls crumbling and floors pancaking downward. 2 days later, after yet another preparatory artillery barrage, the 148th Regiment stormed the finance building to eliminate the last pocket of organized resistance. The final Japanese holdouts had retreated into an elevator shaft, where they made their last stand. American forces methodically eliminated this position, and by dawn on the 3rd of March, resistance finally ceased. That afternoon, General Griswold transmitted a message to Kruger announcing that all enemy resistance had ended. The Battle of Manila was officially over. Yet the true horror of those 3 weeks extended far beyond the military casualties and combat operations. As the fighting raged through Manila's streets and districts, Japanese naval troops, lacking the discipline and organization of regular army units and facing certain death, turned their fury against the civilian population in acts of incomprehensible brutality. Districts including Tondo, Binondo and Paco suffered systematic burning. Japanese soldiers herded women and children into churches, schools and public buildings, then incinerated them with gasoline and grenades or simply set the structures ablaze. Men were dragged into backyards, empty lots and garbage pits to be bayoneted or shot. Survivor testimony and diaries recovered after the battle documented hundreds of civilians burned alive in movie theatres, in Bayview Cathedral, and at St. Paul's School. Families crawled into sewers and drainage pipes, desperately pushing children through narrow openings in hopes they might survive even if their parents did not. At the residence of the Quirino family, Japanese soldiers murdered the wife and children of Manuel Roxas, a prominent politician, forcing him to witness their deaths while unable to intervene. Witness named Lourdes Reyes provided testimony describing civilians dragged to the Pasig River, where soldiers methodically cut their throats before pushing bodies into the current to be carried away by the flow. Others hiding in the Bayview Hotel suffered gang rape before being killed. As American artillery expanded its bombardment to support advancing infantry, civilians trapped in air raid shelters and basement refuges died crushed under collapsing buildings or burned alive when fires spread through structures. In the battle's aftermath, American military authorities conducted investigations attempting to determine the causes of civilian casualties. Their estimates concluded that the majority of civilian deaths resulted directly from Japanese massacres and deliberate atrocities rather than from combat operations. However, they also acknowledged with somber honesty that American artillery fire, while militarily necessary to reduce casualties among assault troops, had inflicted substantial losses on the civilian population trapped in the combat zones. The artillery that saved American soldiers' lives simultaneously destroyed the buildings sheltering Filipino families. By the 3rd of March in 1945, Manila had been reduced to ruins that shocked even hardened combat veterans. The 3-week battle cost American forces 1,010 dead and 5,565 wounded, representing significant losses for what was essentially an urban siege operation. The Japanese garrison suffered virtually total annihilation, with only a handful of survivors among the 16,000 defenders. More than 16,000 Japanese bodies were eventually counted, though the total likely exceeded this figure, as some remains were never recovered from collapsed buildings and rubble. But the civilian population bore the heaviest burden by far. 100,000 Filipinos perished during those 3 weeks, making Manila one of the greatest urban catastrophes of the entire Second World War. Only Warsaw and potentially some Soviet cities suffered comparable civilian losses during street fighting. The American artillery that provided essential protection for advancing infantry also reduced the ancient district of Intramuros to heaps of broken stone and shattered memories. The city's entire infrastructure lay in ruins. Water systems, electrical generation and distribution, transportation networks, telephone exchanges, all had been destroyed or severely damaged. Hospitals, schools, universities, and residential neighborhoods existed only as rubble-filled lots where buildings once stood. After combat operations concluded, American forces immediately transitioned from military operations to occupation and reconstruction duties. Engineers worked to construct temporary bridges, replacing the destroyed permanent spans across the Pasig River. Demolition teams carefully cleared mines and unexploded ordnance from streets and buildings. Military police established patrols to prevent looting and maintain some semblance of order among the traumatized civilian population. Soldiers, though provided with films, dances, and hot meals as morale-boosting measures, still confronted daily the grim reality of a city scarred by disease, malnutrition, destruction, and haunting memories that would persist for generations. From a purely military perspective, the battle demonstrated the devastating power of combined arms warfare conducted by a modern army with superiority in every category of military capability. Even though air power played a limited role inside the city proper, American forces benefited from total air superiority that prevented Japanese reinforcement or resupply. Once the restrictions on artillery fire had been lifted, American tactical doctrine evolved rapidly to minimize friendly casualties. Units learned to systematically level each block with artillery and tank fire before advancing infantry forward, accepting the destruction of buildings as a necessary cost of protecting soldiers' lives. This adjustment in tactics steadily reduced the casualty rate from an average of 26 deaths per day during the initial phase of fighting to just 6 deaths daily by the end of February, demonstrating the learning curve inherent in urban combat. The Japanese defenders, by contrast, lacked every advantage except geography and determination. They possessed no artillery beyond improvised naval guns, no tanks, minimal communications equipment, and no possibility of air support. Their entire defensive strategy rested on willpower, intimate knowledge of urban terrain, and the city's physical infrastructure itself. They dug foxholes into streets and courtyards, laid mines in stairwells and corridors, positioned machine guns in windows and doorways, and resolved to contest every room of every building until death ended the fight. Individual soldiers displayed remarkable tenacity and courage, fighting from positions that offered no hope of survival or relief. But such determination, however admirable from a purely military standpoint, could not overcome the overwhelming material advantages enjoyed by American forces conducting a systematic encirclement supported by unlimited artillery ammunition and complete control of supply lines. The Battle of Manila holds the distinction of being the first and only occasion during the Pacific War when United States forces had to conduct sustained urban combat operations to capture a major city. Japanese resistance in other locations, while fierce, generally occurred in less developed urban environments or lasted for shorter durations. Manila's liberation cleared the way for completing the conquest of Luzon and establishing the Philippines as a secure base for future operations, but it also exposed with brutal clarity the terrible costs that urban warfare inevitably imposes on civilian populations. In such fighting, every residential building can become a fortress, every family a potential victim. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant blurs when the battlefield encompasses an entire city. Artillery fire that protects advancing soldiers simultaneously destroys homes sheltering civilians who have nowhere else to shelter. The conflagration that consumed Manila in early 1945 destroyed not only historic walls and buildings, but also consumed the innocence and security of an entire generation that witnessed events they would never forget. The battle stands as a permanent warning to future generations about the unparalleled devastation that occurs when warfare penetrates into cities where people live. It reminds all who study military history that peace and human life possess value beyond any strategic objective, and that the costs of urban warfare, measured not in buildings or territory but in human suffering, often exceed any possible military benefit. The ruins of Intramuros, the bodies pulled from the Pasig River, the charred remains of civilians in churches and schools, all testified to a fundamental truth that war's true horror emerges most clearly when armies fight among the homes of ordinary people who simply wanted to survive until peace returned.